Sounds like you all are ready. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ripon Molly. Along with Jenny Davis, we co-direct the Center for Indigenous Science. And Jenny and I will have more words of appreciation at the reception. That's at 4 o'clock. And then just a reminder that we have a panel at 2 p.m. with 4 very inspiring speakers. So if you have time then, make sure you are able to make it. But I want to start off by reading our land acknowledgement. So the Carl R. Woese Institute for Genomic Biology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign recognizes and acknowledges that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Pankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of the Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge these people of these lands, as well as their histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. And so the Center for Indigenous Science moves beyond acknowledgement and provides a place to actively support Indigenous peoples and communities. The center is a partnership between the American Indian Studies Program and the Institute for Genomic Biology. We work closely with the Associate Vice Chancellor for Native Affairs and are supported by the Provost's Office, the Office for the Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation, the Office for the Vice Chancellor of DEI, the College of LAS, including the Department of Anthropology and the Humanities Research Institute. The center works to bring together Indigenous nations and university expertise for the co-production of knowledge and solutions that support tribal sovereignty and Indigenous needs. The center also provides a university-sponsored space that allows citizens of Indigenous nations to work in partnership with university faculty on projects of interest. And importantly, the Center for Indigenous Science is a place to participate in cutting-edge science with and by Indigenous scholars and communities on local, regional, and global scales. So we're really excited today to begin the launch with a dynamic and very generous speaker and Indigenous scientist. So Dr. Aviaha Leiberth Houtman is an Inuk microbiologist. She received her BSc in biology at the University of Copenhagen and PhD in microbial ecology and bioinformatics from Technical University of Denmark. She was a visiting Carlsberg Foundation postdoctoral fellow in the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences at UC Davis. And she has now moved back to Greenland too with her colleague Liv Larsen, start a biology program at the University of Greenland based on Indigenous knowledge. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Houtman.
Thank you so much, Ripon. This is on, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And thank you to the Center for Indigenous Science for inviting me here onto these lands. I'm incredibly honored to be able to share this really important ceremony with you at the beginning of something that I find to be very, very important, such as the Center for Indigenous Science. My name is Aviaya. I was born and raised in Greenland. I am Inuk. I'm part of the West Greenlandic Inuit community. I'm also Danish. And what I would like to talk about today is my journey from this little girl who grew up in Greenland to this professional being, an educated person that I am today, but also very much a journey that I've been through in the past 5-10 years of allowing these two spheres to melt together. And so today when I do my research, I don't do it as this fragmented professional being. I try to do it as best as I can as a whole being, as also an Indigenous person. And that has been a journey for me. I've not done that always, and that's the story that I would like to share today. I want to begin by saying that it actually means a lot to me that this goes on at this particular institute, at this particular university, because the findings of Carl Arwos and his colleagues were my first science love. And that was really like my entry into this world of science started with just a deep fascination of the 16S rRNA gene and what we can do with it. And this finding has been my methodology throughout my science career. I've always done metagenomics and used the 16S gene a lot. And I think it's important for me to say that I have, and I very much had a love for science in its own right. And that's important for me to say because the rest of the talk will have some criticism of academia and the field of science too. But that doesn't mean that you can't love science. What we're here about today is to allow for those two things to coexist and not to do just one of them. So while I was a student, I did my bachelor's and master's degree in general biology at the University of Copenhagen, and I gradually specialized in microbiology, applied microbiology, and biotechnology. And during my studies, I never came across indigeneity as a concept. It was just not a topic. And I think it's important to say in this context that the Danish system is different. If you're studying to become a biologist, you only have biology courses. You can't have like a major and a minor. It's just biology courses. And even though Denmark is a former colonial nation, colonialism, indigeneity is just not part of curriculum when you're studying biology. So I did come across a mentioning of my indigenous culture once during my studies. So I took a course in medical microbiology at the Technical University of Denmark, and we had this textbook. And the sentence that I want to highlight is the one that starts at the bottom here. Traditional dishes such as fish or seal flipper fermented in a barrel buried in the ground cannot be recommended by a bacteriologist! Exclamation mark. So what it says here is for me to become a microbiologist, I have to become a person who rejects my community's food culture. And I think we all know that going to university, becoming part of academia is also learning a certain culture, a certain way of acting, a certain way of asking questions. I know that was part of my pedagogy curriculum at university. That's just a well-acknowledged thing, that there's a culture in academia, and when you go there, you learn how to act in that culture, to become part of that community. What we don't often talk about is that for some people, becoming part of that community is also letting go of a part of yourself. And I think that's very much so for Indigenous peoples and young Indigenous persons going to university, feeling like they have to leave part of them behind. And for me, that meant leaving behind a trust in people who ferment seal flippers. And that's a very important point that hopefully something like the center can go in and change. So after I did my bachelor's and master's degree, I went on to do a PhD at the Technical University of Denmark. And my focus at the time was microbes in snow and ice environment using a metagenomics approach. And after I finished my PhD, I had been living in Denmark for 21 years. And I felt like I was ready to move back to Greenland. The samples that I was working with were from Greenland. I did not sample them myself. I only worked with Greenland as a theme, but not in community, not in Greenland. So at the time, I had found a partner in Denmark, we had a son, and we decided to move back to Greenland. And I also wanted to shift the focus of my research. I had learned this incredible tool of metagenomics and bioinformatics, and I wanted to apply it to something that perhaps was a little bit more relevant to my community. So I shifted my focus to the microbiomes of our traditional foods. And one thing that I want to mention is that when you are a PhD student working with microbes in snow and ice environments, and you're at an institute that with a lot of people who work with snow and ice microbes, it seems like it's the most important thing in the world. Like, how could anyone not be interested in what the microbe on the Greenland ice sheet is doing? But I reflected on this a little bit, and I took a step back, and I thought, okay, I think actually my community in Greenland does not care what the microbe on the Greenland ice sheet is doing. So that was sort of a motivation to shift towards something that was interesting for my community. So there are 2 points about our traditional foods in Greenland that's important to know. One thing is that they are wild foods, foods that are harvested in the wild. They're prepared in the wild. They're not domesticated, they're not grown, and they're not industrially processed. And that has a lot of implications for microbial ecology, because my hypothesis is that when we eat foods from the wild, prepared in the wild, we connect our internal ecosystems to our surrounding ecosystems. And if we eat foods from the natural environment, away from the urban environment, we connect ourselves to nature, if we can call it that, through microorganisms. So that's the main thing that I work with today. The other thing that's important to note is that our foods are animal sourced. So what you see here is the dried capelin, a fish that we dry and eat whole, and some mettek, the raw whale skin, often of narwhal, and then some dried cod. All of our foods are animal sourced. We have a few berries, we have some angelica, but those aren't really major parts of our food. So between 98 to 100% of pre-colonial foods in Greenland have been animal sourced. And when I was a PhD student, again, I was at this institute. Some researchers were looking at snow and ice microbes, but other researchers had shifted their focus to this incredibly hot topic in microbiology, the human gut microbiome. And at this time, there were publications, particularly some very seminal ones, not so much with, but on the Hadza population in Tanzania, looking at indigenous people's gut microbiomes. And what these studies concluded was that the Hadza had a very diverse gut microbiome. An ecosystem with high diversity is perceived to be a resilient ecosystem and therefore a healthy ecosystem. And the researchers focused very much on the content of fiber in the Hadza diet and concluded therefore on behalf of all peoples in all of the world that to have a healthy gut microbiome, you need to eat a lot of plant fiber like the Hadza do. But then coming back to the indigenous diet that I come from, which is almost 100% animal sourced, we did not eat plant fiber. So when you come from that perspective, you can see that there's something missing. And I started thinking, okay, so maybe this science thing isn't quite as objective as I thought it was. And maybe there's some pieces missing in this. And that motivated me to go into researching also the human gut microbiome from a Greenlandic perspective. So something that I did at this point that I was not very reflected about back then is something that a lot of indigenous scholars do. And Ayu Qassadaq has said this in citing Bernice Joseph in a much better way than I can. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read out this quote. There's a critical difference between Western researchers with their aspiration to objectivity and theory and indigenous researchers who often have a deeply personal investment in their research. This was described beautifully by the late Dr. Bernice Joseph, Koyukon of Nulakdu, in her dissertation, which focused on transforming educational practices for Native students. She asserted that this is a distinguishing factor of all indigenous peoples' efforts. She described the mental and emotional labors of indigenous scholars in this way. The emotional labor emerges from a commitment by many indigenous scholars to focus on outcomes rather than just theory as a means of liberation for collective purposes. In other words, indigenous people's work, whether planning, researching, or educating, is driven by the desire and need for the collective liberation of indigenous peoples. The academic work of indigenous scholars is not often driven by theory or by other pursuits that are unrelated to the thriving of indigenous peoples. So I think this is a core element of Indigenous science, is that we ask ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing? For who are we doing what we're doing? And I think that comes quite naturally to most Indigenous scholars, and something that I would call a core element of Indigenous science. So we moved back to Greenland. I started a postdoc, and one of the studies that came out of this was this one. At this point in sort of my journey, I was still thinking only with the microbiology side of my brain. I came sterile cotton pig and RNA later and metagenomics, and that was my focus. I went hunting with my family, so that was different. My family comes from a very long tradition of hunting in an area in Greenland called Anguyartofig. So for many generations, my family comes back every summer to this place to hunt caribou and muskox. And then we dry the meat for consumption throughout the year, especially for celebrations. And I was able to move back, bring my son on our annual hunting trip, and sample the foods that come from our hunting traditions. I want to just highlight one result from this study. So we looked at different types of foods that come from hunting practices. So I mapped out the drying process, what happens, what kind of microbes develop during the drying process, but also the content of the caribou stomach, because the eating of intestines and intestinal content is a big part of Greenlandic food culture. And that, of course, has a lot of microbial implications because the caribou gut is also full of microorganisms. And the result I want to highlight is this bar to the very right, which is the caribou stomach. And what the bar shows, for those who are not always looking at 16S data, is that it's all of the microbes in the caribou stomach, and each color represents a different microorganism and how much relatively there is of this type of microorganism. So as you see, there's quite a lot of the green ones, but it's the yellow one that I want to talk about, because those were the Prevotella. And the Prevotella were not present in any of the other samples. And it makes a lot of sense that you find Prevotella in the stomach of the caribou because they love plant fiber. And they were actually also part of this Hadza study. The Hadza had a lot of Prevotella in their stomach because they eat plant fiber. And seeing this result had me go through a number of reflections. One thing is that Prevotella are important for human health because if we don't have them, if we don't have microbes like Prevotella or other microbes that degrade plant fiber, we can't get a health benefit from plant fiber. The human body does nothing to plant fiber. We need that collaboration with plant-eating microorganisms to get a health benefit from plant fiber. And what that had me thinking is that if I had traveled back in time, met my ancestors who ate no plant fiber, they probably did not have Prevotella in their stomach because they were not feeding these microorganisms. If you don't eat plant fiber, the Prevotella will disappear because you're not feeding them. And if you don't have the Prevotella, you don't get a health benefit from plant fiber. And this is an important point to me because in a world where we are increasingly focused on a plant-based diet, it's important for me to make the statement that no diet can be planetary, that there's no diet that suits all populations. And microbial ecology is part of that. I think other points are even more important, like we need to eat place-based because place-based foods are family relationships, our understanding of our environment and the climate. But microorganisms is also part of this. And then there's a small back tail to this because last year I had a notification that someone cited this study. And I was curious to see what were they saying and what was it about. And it turned out this paper actually took our whole figure and reproduced it, which is completely okay. It's in the comments, you can do that. But what they used it for was, I'm just gonna read up what I highlighted here, was a study that has this approach. So, traditional foods inherit a long history and colorful cultures and are closely bound with the dietary patterns of Indigenous people. However, the science and wisdom of traditional foods are not thoroughly understood by local people in their historical context. So what this paper that reproduces our figure says is that indigenous peoples, in their historical context, in their lives, do not understand the wisdom of their own foods. Their conclusion is, science to the rescue, science must come in and help us all to understand these foods, and also promote the transition of these foods from homemade and scale to standardized manufacturing with global availability and acceptance. So I mean, for some people, apparently this is logical, but to me, this is really horrific. So I've been working on figuring out how I can sort of put this into words and get it out there just to say this is not okay. And that's an important point as an Indigenous scholar, as someone who is personally invested in the stories that I bring. You feel a responsibility when you see something like this. And that's something that you just have to accept. We also did another study where we did somewhat the same thing, just with dried fish. This is the drying capelin, a very important keystone species in our marine ecosystem and a keystone species in our diet. Again, it's dried and then we eat them throughout the year. And again, this study, I was only using my microbiology brain, which apparently sits over here. But I'm not going to highlight a microbiological result, or it's not just a microbiological result. I had a collaborator that I knew from a trip to this area in Greenland called the Disco Bay area. And when he heard that I was interested in looking at the dried capelin and what kind of microbes that are on them, what kind of microbes we feed ourselves with when we eat these, he sent me samples of some very particular capelin. So what he said is that these ones are tastier than the ones that we dry ourselves. They wash up on the shore every summertime, about 3 months. All the capelin come to the west coast of Greenland, so we can harvest them in big numbers and dry them. But some of them roll up on the shore, and he says they are more tasty, and he was curious about what kind of microbes are on these particular dried capelin. So we looked at that, and it turned out that these were slightly fermented and did have microorganisms that are well known to be able to enhance taste, like the type of microorganisms that you will find in an Emmental cheese. And these microorganisms are able to produce propionate. And propionate is interesting because it's been looked at in the context of the gut microbiome as a molecule that can induce satiety. And when I've been presenting this result, I've had the question like, oh, that's excellent. So we can take out the microbe from the fish, and then we can take out the molecule from the microbe, and then we can eat these pills. That will make us feel full, and we won't eat so much. So this sort of reductionistic perspective to what can we use the results for. And it's interesting because the scientific method is very much based on reductionism. But we tend to assume that we must use the results for the same reductionist purposes. So I think it's important to say that even though the scientific method has a way of wanting to be very specific and reductionist, we don't have to take the results to do something that has a reductionist approach to the world. So this result can just as well be used to say, like, keep eating your dried fish. They're excellent. And they do make you feel full, which people already know, of course. So in some ways, yeah. And then there's another thing. This particular interaction could be framed as science validating a piece of Indigenous knowledge. But it's so important that we refrain from that approach, and this instead, think of it as this is a very good example of when Indigenous understanding can really lead science somewhere that's more meaningful. Because I had not included these in my studies. I was not able to talk about flavor and other things because I did not know this. So because an Indigenous person, a collaborator, was kind to give me this information, I was able to direct my science in a more meaningful direction. And then there's also a small tail to this. I just want to recommend this site because I was really honored to see that the people behind this site had actually taken this study and included it in a database of Indigenous science. So there is a wonderful database that looks at collaborative projects with by and for Indigenous peoples, and I can really recommend looking into that if you don't already know it. So I finished this postdoc and went on to apply for granting for a new postdoc in collaboration with University of California, Davis, where I moved for the postdoc. And for this postdoc, I wanted to focus on our fermented foods. So this is giviaq, and giviaq are fermenting seabirds in a seal skin. A beautiful illustration by Inuk artist Conal. And the reason that I wanted to look at fermented foods is, of course, fermented foods are foods that have been transformed by microorganisms. So that's an obvious direction to go when you're a microbiologist. And curiously, that led me to northern Greenland to collaborate with a family who ferment seal flippers. And I've learned so much from this trip that I'm still processing it. I've not published any of the microbiology results because I'm still processing the things that I learned from doing the mistakes that I did with this trip. And that's sort of the focus that I want to have now and talk about. So since this trip, a lot of my focus has been on research ethics. We published one piece on this together with collaborators in Nunavut and across Canada and UC Davis, around looking at our fermented foods and always only looking at them in context. And that has been a lot of my time in the past 3-4 years, is thinking about research ethics more than thinking about microbiology. So I want to be very honest with one thing. So one of the reasons that I wanted to do fermented foods, and the giviaq in particular, is because it has become quite famous and infamous. If you Google it, you'll find really obnoxious descriptions of it. But I was reading this book about fermented foods around the globe, and it says that giviaq is one of the most impressive meat fermentations that exist in the world, and there's very little microbial research on it. Such an obvious thing to do as a microbiologist, right? I needed to be that microbiologist who looked at the giviaq and described it microbially to the world. But the people who make the giviaq are from northern Greenland. They do not identify as Inuit. They are Inuit, and I came in there as an outsider. And that's very important for me to be honest about, because if I had the reflection that I have today, I would not have done that. I was very lucky that someone sort of caught me, not caught me as a thief running away, but like caught me so I didn't fall. So what happened is that there's a very long trip from Nuuk to northern Greenland. This dish is common in the northernmost permanently populated place on Earth, Siorapaluk, and I was traveling there, so it's like I have to travel in Nuuk and a helicopter to Siorapaluk. Very long trip. And on my way there, I was lucky that our national radio station wanted to interview me, and they were announcing, in a minute, we'll be talking to Aviaya. And Aviaya, she's on her way to Siorapaluk, and she's interested in doing research on the giviaq. And when they say this, there's a lady in Siorapaluk who becomes very angry with me, because she has reasons to believe that I'm there to look at all the problems of the giviaq. There are food safety issues with many foods, including the giviaq. And she had very good reason to believe that that was what I was there for. Luckily, she listens to the interview, and I'm there to understand the strengths of our foods. How are these foods important to us? And I had also sort of left the idea that I could do this with microbiology alone. So I had invited along my wonderful colleague Menumina Lund Jensen, who is a graduate student in cultural studies, and she is from northern Greenland. So I invited her to make sure that I was not just coming in with a science approach, that she could support me in making sure that I had a much more holistic view of the giviaq. And the lady who became angry instead chose to come to the heliport where we landed and welcome us into her family, and they showed us how to make the giviaq and many, many other things that they taught me, and again, still processing all of that. So one thing, again, another important sort of pillar of what I think of as Indigenous science is to use a strength-based approach, where you center the strengths that you're working with. So a lot of science on Indigenous peoples, a lot of research on Indigenous peoples has focused on our deficits, so what you could call deficit-based research. For us, it's about where the place of the melting ice sheet, where the climate crisis, Greenland that is, where all the suicides, where the alcoholism, where all of these terrible things. And we need to nuance that image because we do have some issues, but we are much more than that. And for some reason, research and science has not chosen to look at all those things, but that's where our solutions are. And lucky for me, that was intuitive. I would never come to Siorapaluk to look at potential food safety issues. I would also never look away from them if they come up in the data, but then at least I would describe them in the context of an important food that also has health benefits. So this is what I call a strength-based approach. And I want to mention these two papers that has given me words to describe this. So I was lucky that I didn't come in with a deficit-based approach. I would have had a very bad welcome in Siorapaluk. But these papers afterwards, coming across this work to get some words to describe what I do, what other people do, and sometimes what some people do wrong, has been incredibly helpful. So I can recommend these by Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck, and also over here in a collaboration with Wayne Yang. I'm not going to go into them, but this is a recommendation. So what happens when you employ a deficit narrative? One thing is that, of course, you make a narrative around a peoples that just reminds us of all the bad things all the time, so that we feel that we're broken. And we're not always broken, and we have opportunity to not be broken. But another thing is that it really can make incredibly big mistakes and be very harmful in different ways. And I wanted to bring an example because I brought my colleague Manumina. I had realized that I needed to expand the way that I see things, not just through microbiology, but with other lenses. So I spent a lot of time reading historical literature describing our food system, our fermentation practices. And one of the things I came across was this Danish official in Greenland who was describing our food culture. And I'm going to read this aloud. The masses of meat produced are immense. And it would seem that if all of it were dried, the Greenlanders could not by any means suffer want in winter. But this is unfortunately not the case. The Greenlanders, and especially the women, being too much children of the moment, they're often content with drying the smaller part of it and then let the remainder lie rotting. And this in spite of the fact that the very last winter they have perhaps been starving for want of provisions. Yes, it even happens so that they do not even care to cut open the seals in proper time, so that both skin and meat lies and becomes rotten in the blazing sun. So this is coming from someone who assumes that we'll rather be in the moment than make sure that our children survive next winter. That assumes that we do not know how to survive in this place that we've lived for 1,000 years. If you bring a strength-centered narrative and an understanding of context, you would know that of course we can survive in this place. Of course we know how to prepare. And one of the ways that we can prepare is by fermenting seals. So fermentation is a preservation process so that you save food for later use. But if you're a Danish official and you think that fermented seal is not delicious, then this is a description of wastefulness, not preservation. So it's the complete opposite conclusion that you draw when you use a deficit-based narrative and you don't have an understanding of context. And then the final thing that I want to highlight from this trip is that it sort of blew open my eyes to the concept of food sovereignty. So what you see here are fermented eider eggs that are incredibly beautiful. The story about how they're made is very beautiful, and the flavor is really incredible. And when I came back to Nuuk after this trip, I was talking about this at a gathering, and someone told me that eider eggs are illegal to collect. And that was really transformative for me because I had been in Siorapaluk, which is a town of about 60 inhabitants. There's one shop, and in this shop there was a kiwi fruit from Chile. So we have a food system which is generally accepted, where we can ship this fuzzy little fruit from the southern tip of the world literally to the community neighboring the North Pole, and that's okay. That's completely legal. Everyone thinks it's okay. But for families to collect eider eggs and preserve knowledge that has been built up through generations, that's illegal. And I think this is really important for us in a Greenlandic context to talk about whether or not we do have food sovereignty, because we used to be a colony of Denmark for almost 300 years. And today we have governance on foods, but the foods that are represented formally in Greenland are still Danish foods. So I want to give you an example here. What you see are images from two children's books in Greenlandic. And the children's books are specifically for language revitalization. So Galatlisut Greenlandic is very common in Greenland. A lot of Greenlanders speak only Greenlandic, but especially children in the city areas are losing language. So there are these incredible children's books where you can learn Greenlandic words. But if you look at the food pages, there's only plant-based foods. There's not a single indigenous food, local food, traditional food on the pages in this book that's teaching us our language. Instead, the children can learn how to say bønner, which is a Danish word for a food imported from Denmark, or kikærter, which is a Danish word for a food imported from Denmark. A word that's not in these books is galalimanlit, and that's what we call our indigenous foods in the West Greenlandic language. And what galalimanlit means is a little piece of a Greenlander, or what makes up Greenlanders. So that's how much we assign identities to our foods, but in this book, our foods are not represented. So there's really a discussion we need to have in Greenland about food sovereignty, and that's how I suddenly found myself reading food sovereignty literature instead of microbiology papers. And one thing is to write papers, or at least try to write papers and try to get it published. Another thing is really to think about what can we do with this, because I feel that it's really urgent. So I teamed up with a wonderful collaborator, photographer Karsten Evang, and we are starting up a project called the Ammasek. This is what we call the Kapelin in Galatlisut. And what we want to do is to create awareness of the strengths of our foods using the Ammasek as an example. What does food mean to us more than just something that makes us full? But it does make us full. It's the one with the propionate. Besides potential content of propionate, it also has high amounts of calcium. And that is important because right now, the dietary recommendations for children in Greenland is that they should drink half a liter of milk a day. And Inuit are lactose intolerant. So we have a food system where we've not questioned our colonial history and what that does to us today in terms of food. So that is something that we really hope to do with this. And the goal is to have those words taken out of the diet recommendation and put in the Ammasek instead. And the final project that I want to mention is me slowly coming back to microbiology, because it is my passion. I love microorganisms, even in their own right. I just don't feel like I can work with them without including my whole person anymore. So this is a slow attempt to start to move back to microbiology and think of microbiology in an indigenous context. So this will be part of a book trilogy called Tumbling Ecologies. It's not been published yet, but I just want to mention one thing from this piece, and that's my reflection on how to do science. And the reflections that I've had align very well with the 7 Indigenous story work principles, which is the work of Joanne Archibald and her colleagues. And if you don't already know this, really recommend this work. So these 7 story work principles, first of them is respect. And to me, respect means that I don't think of myself as a superhero coming in to save people with all the scientific knowledge that I have. I'm always there to learn from people who know better than me. And it's interesting that we used to call knowledgeable, wise people in our communities ilisimadud. But that's today the word for scientist. And this is really problematic because as a scientist, you know so much about very little. But an ilisimadog is someone who understands the whole. So I think that's something that we need to question, and that we always come in as someone who's there to learn with respect for the people that we work with. And then the principle of reciprocity to me means that I value people's time and their knowledge, their intellectual property. I pay them for their time, if that makes sense in the context that we're in. And also very importantly, I don't show up as a professional. I show up as a mother and as a daughter and as a Greenlander and as everything that I am. And that means that the relationships that we built through this research are personal relationships, that they are lasting relationships. So it's not when a project ends, I still have these relationships. And that puts a limit to how many people I can do work with. I cannot do incredibly large projects because I cannot have personal relationships with so many people. It also means that I'm honest to myself and to others about what I gain from this research. Again, I'm not a superhero. I'm not just doing this out of my incredibly good bleeding heart. I'm also doing this because I really like doing this work. I get so many opportunities from this. I get to stand here today with you all. I get a lot from this work, and I have to be very honest to people about that. And then relevance is the same thing that I mentioned before. We ask, for whom are we doing this? I'm not ever going to ask people to engage in research that's not interesting or relevant to them, just for the sake of academia and science. And the final thing is responsibility. And that means that we consider the implications of the work that we do. That we don't just think about how that journal paper is going to look like, but what the impacts and potential implications of that work will be. I know that research can be damaging and have unforeseen consequences if we don't understand the context very deeply. So responsibility to me means that knowing that objectivity is not necessarily a good thing, and sometimes it can actually be quite damaging. And then the final 3 principles I'm not going to go through because there's no time, but that's what this figure is about, is to feel what's the context and the whole and the synergy that exists around microorganisms in the context of Greenland and our food culture. So I'm there, I think. It's about time. And the final thing that I want to say is that this journey has not been easy. It's not always easy. It's incredibly meaningful to me, but it's not very easy. And I think it's so important for me to say that if I had not had a few, or sometimes many, but most often few people around me who could support me in following my gut feelings, I would probably not have done it the way that I've done today. I might still have been stuck in a deficit-based narrative. So I want to thank you for doing this center, because you're creating a space for people to be able to follow their gut feelings when they do science, and it's so, so important. So thank you very much for inviting me here.
Time for questions?
Let's turn it on. It's gotta be green.
Hi. Such an amazing talk. Enthralled is not the word I use, but I was just hooked onto the whole talk, and I think one of the things that I want to say before I ask the question as well is that communication is such an important factor when it comes to bringing and bridging all of these gaps, as I've seen in my country as well. And you did an amazing job at that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my question is about Provatela. So if I'm getting this right, caribou is the animal whose gut has Provatela, right? So how does this relate to what the microbial composition is right now in your community, as well as what it was before? I didn't really get that part.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your comments and your question. So what I realized when I saw the Provatela, they are in the gut because the caribou, the reindeer, eats plant fiber, right? And eating the content of the caribou stomach means eating the plant fiber together with the microorganisms that degrade plant fiber. So what happens when we eat plant fiber is that if we have the right microorganisms, they will degrade it and make them into short-chain fatty acids that are important to our overall well-being, very, very important to our well-being. So if you eat those microorganisms together with the plant fiber, then you can actually get that health benefit. I know that it's a little bit complicated because there are several points in this. But if you are a person, like an Inuk person 300 years ago, who does not eat plant fiber, you will not have those microorganisms, and the plant fiber would just pass through. And the important point from that is just that not everyone has a benefit from plant fiber. It's contextual. And if we then take that to today, we've been a colony of Denmark for a long time, and the Danish stable is a very fiber-rich type of bread. So today our population eats a lot of plant fiber. So our gut microbes probably are resembling Danish gut microbiomes a lot more today than they were pre-colonization. I hope that answers your question.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm coming to this question from actually art history, but I'm also dealing with issues of food sovereignty in the work that I look at. So I'm just curious if there are particular sources that you're currently enamored with in terms of food sovereignty in the Arctic. I think my sort of small window into it has been through the writing of Sheila Watt-Cloutier from the Canadian Inuit perspective.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So what I've sort of realized that I do is to, instead of doing what science often does, to sort of reduce something to its components and then universalize based on that, is that I do the opposite. I go down and see something specific in its context and then think about that at the local level. And I think I've taken the same approach to food sovereignty, so that I've been reading very much about the importance of Inuit foods for Inuit identity as a part of this, and I'm happy to give you references. And there's a few resources also on Indigenous peoples and food sovereignty specifically that are sort of borderline relevant. The reason that I really need to be local with the Greenlandic example is because we have a very specific situation where it's actually Indigenous peoples themselves promoting an imported diet. So it's a very different way of having to criticize than in a situation where the Indigenous peoples are the minority and the majority is others. But I'm happy to give you some references after if you want.
Can I ask one more question before I pass it? Thanks so much. I'm wondering if you could also speak a little bit about your current work in building the department, I think.
So there'll be a panel after.
Oh, sorry.
That's totally okay.
Great.
But it would, you couldn't stop me if I started. So I'm not even going to go in there. Yeah.
I wanted to also thank you for that really inspirational I wanted to also thank you for that really inspirational talk. My question relates to a slide you had at the very beginning and then at the end with respect to theory. I think the early slide said no theory, but then the last slide with all the really important insights and principles sounds like it could be a theory. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
I'd be happy to. Thank you for that question. So it's not about no theory. It's about both and. It's about allowing theory to be part of meaningful work. It's to not do theory in its own right. And the last slide, you're thinking about the principles, because it is a theory, but that theory is about how do we do meaningful work. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's not something that we're curious about in its own right. We're not just centering around the word respect. What does respect mean? And then we publish a paper on an abstract concept of respect. It's about how do you conduct your research with respect. So it's connected to action. I hope that makes sense. Also, very important point, and I'm sorry if I said that in a way so that you could perceive it as if theory should be rejected, because it certainly shouldn't. There's lots of we've developed theory for hundreds of years, and this is not about rejecting hundreds of years of work. It's about thinking, how is that work meaningful today and also to Indigenous peoples?
Thank you. It was probably my fault for misunderstanding.
Thank you very much for that very inspirational talk. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. In the U.S., there's like a very increasing awareness of Indigenous people, particularly in Alaska, and the idea of needing to engage them. And there's a big push for a discussion for co-production of science, co-production of knowledge. And it sounds like that you are the pioneer in Greenland, although you were Western educated, but in a Western science, but then you're engaging your community to understand the broader picture of the science that you're trying to do. So besides microbiomes and microbiology, there's huge impacts of climate change on ecology, Greenland ice sheet and such things. I was wondering if there might be a more concerted effort of engaging Indigenous knowledge in all these different fields of science. Most of them, of course, were from Western countries coming into Greenland. And as far as I know, they are trying to find ways to engage Indigenous people's knowledge. So can you comment on that?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so Greenland currently does not have research ethical guidelines at all. You can come into Greenland from anywhere and do practically any kind of research, not clinical research. There is a clinical research ethics board. But other than that, you can come in and do any kind of research. And so there's development ongoing right now, and part of that is to think about how to engage communities. Greenland has an interesting situation right now where indigeneity is still to some degree contested. So you will see a lot of outside researchers speaking like, we're going to Greenland, there are Indigenous peoples, that's why we're coming to take their blood, because they're Indigenous, but at the same time actually neglecting Indigenous people's rights. Because when we start putting boundaries to what we'll allow, it's like, well, you're part of Denmark, aren't you? And you're not like real Indigenous people. So it's very complicated. But there is a development ongoing. And what I want to say about that is, again, like there's a way that you can approach co-production of knowledge as theory alone. And I see that happening a lot, where it becomes ticking off of boxes. And there's a way to approach it where what you do can be described as co-production of knowledge, but you're not doing it because you read it in a paper, you're doing it because it's the only thing that feels right. And I think that's a gap that still needs to be bridged, because there's extensive literature by now on how to do collaborative research, how to do co-production of knowledge. But we're not still talking about why is it not natural to people to do it this way? And that's a process that I really feel we need to push towards. And also, we're a population of 56,000 people. Once we realize that we can only do research collaboratively, there needs to be a lot less research, because we can't handle so many projects. And that goes for scholars who are invited into grants and projects. That goes for communities that are not in academia. It's just incredible research fatigue is spreading across all of us. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much for a presentation on such a diverse set of issues. It seems like you were able to cover a lot more than just seal flippers. I wanted specifically to ask you a question about, you mentioned language being used. Also, first, I also want to thank you for putting in context the CIS, how the actual implementation of this space will not just acknowledge how university has been involved in perpetuating the marginalization of different peoples, but will also address it. And I think that's a really important context for me to understand. But specifically, my question is about the language that you said is used for scientists in Greenland, that you said that it is sort of it is implicit of a knowingness rather than a seekingness. And I wanted to know, obviously, language changes are not dictated by you. I'm sure there's a lot of involvement in tribal council and stuff like that, but I wanted to know if there's any move to reframe that word scientist within your community as it relates to the way that we speak is the way that we think.
No, and we don't have councils and formal stuff like that. We're just a country with people who are free to do, there's no coordinated thinking about our approach to things as Indigenous people. So that's something that hopefully can develop, and there are incredible young Inuit scholars who are working with language, and who are reflected about these things. So maybe soon there'll be a discussion around this. Thank you.
I can ask the last question. So as you start to think about microbiology and microbiomes again, and maybe generate some data, I was wondering if you had thoughts about how you're going to approach that data and Indigenous data sovereignty and the tension with open access in science.
Yes, that's on my mind a lot. So for now, we need to share the data that if we want to publish. One of my PhD students working on a project on the eating of intestines and intestinal content. And we're generating a large amount of data, and once he wants to publish that, he needs to deposit the data somewhere so someone can do that again, or can sort of verify our results. So that's where we are right now. What I've been thinking about a lot is that there's still a general idea that open access is a good thing, but we don't realize that even for microbiology, open access is great for those who have the resources, the manpower, the infrastructure to just crunch through it and publish a lot of papers. And we're a small lab, right? There are 2 PhD students and then Liu and I doing the biology program. So we don't benefit from other people's open access data, and our data is rare. You need to have personal relationships with people to get to the types of data that we have. So it's something that we struggle with a little bit, not being allowed to keep the data to ourselves. And I'd be very curious to hear if we have options. So there are initiatives to map all Indigenous peoples' microbiomes and all of the fermented foods that Indigenous peoples have centrally. And that's something that I hope that we can organize as Indigenous scientists to discuss approaches like this, because I see a lot of potential dangers in that, but I don't have a solution.
Great. Thank you. So let's thank Dr. Hopman again.
Thank you.